oil spikes above $100, what happens to gold and silver? That's the $1 million question that everybody asks me, right? So in that scenario, I'm sad to say, in the short term, I think gold and silver are going to dump. Like the prices are going to dump. Just it's simple. The logic is simple. In that scenario, let's say I'm just going to use Japan as an example. I know Japan has 250 days of oil reserves, but they're going to be freaking out. They potentially might start dumping everything, including US Treasury bonds, by the way, in this scenario. Because the US, number one, the US is quotation marks losing, okay? Number two, they need all the US dollars they can get their hands on to buy the marginal oil in the world that is denominated in US dollars. Make sense? So everything gets sold to raise US dollars. So you have that US dollar liquidity squeeze. US dollars versus other currencies go up. Everything goes down, including US Treasury bonds. Gold and silver goes down temporarily, right? Because they're selling everything to try to get oil. And I'm sorry to say this actually might happen. Okay? So just be prepared mentally that this happens. This is sort of like, I don't know how severe it will be.
A bit like
March
March
2000, sorry,
20, yeah.
yeah, 2020 is an example of that,
Yeah.
right? I don't know how severe this is going to be. So they're going to dump everything, raise US dollars to buy oil, including this time. The only difference is that they are, if you look at the US Treasury bond prices right now, they are not rising, they're dipping, right? So including US Treasuries. Normally in the past, they run to US Treasuries, right? As a safe haven. This time, no. Everything get dumped, including US Treasuries, goes into oil.
But then I guess central banks would step in like they did in 2020. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
we've seen that the U.S. Treasury just announced they're going to step into the oil futures market. So they're not prepared to let things burn.
Okay, so after the initial dump, and they get like, what the fight for wherever marginal oil is done, then I think gold and silver is going to find a bottom and it's going to rebound pretty hard, just like 2020. In that scenario, like I said, I think oil will back off and dump, but maybe not as severe as scenario number one. Okay. Gold and silver, I think, um, might not dump in that scenario because now you don't have people racing to dump whatever they own to get US dollars to buy oil, right? It's back to normal, sort of. So I think gold and silver in that situation will probably go sideways, like not dump too much from where we are now, and then it'll find a find their feet, okay, and then it'll go up because in the mid to long term, I think the world, the institutions around the world, they're not stupid. They know what happened. They know that despite the rhetoric and the propaganda, right? They would know that the U.S. did not and Israel did not achieve their strategic objectives, and they simply just talk. It's just like a kind of like face-saving retreat for for Israel and the U.S., right? So
Yeah.
I think for gold and silver stackers, scenario number three is probably the best. That's like for lack of a better word, Mario, that's the taco. That's the
Yeah.
taco scenario,
Oh,
right?
taco. Yeah.
Like
And
taco scenario. Yeah,
also that would mean that the Gulf cooperation countries they would pretty much be free to do what they want, and I think it would be the end of U.S. Power in the Middle East because
correct.
just pretend they win and they just withdraw and say everything's fine, and Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, which they don't. But
Yes.
yeah, so yeah, like you said, scenario three is the best, really, not just for the world, but also for like precious metals investors.
So Mario, I just want to say, like, there are many different scenarios in this situation, right? With in regards of the war in Iran, with the US and Israel. So I think to properly address your question, we need to look at basic scenarios that that this situation may turn out to be. Okay, so number one, I think this is what a lot of the pro-war people are saying. So let's say everything that Trump is telling us is true. Okay, there's some damages to the bases, U.S. bases all over the Middle East, but it's not super critical. They can let's say they can rebuild it within couple years. I don't know, maybe a year, right? Okay, let's say that's the scenario. And let's say they manage to regime change in Iran. So they install somebody somebody they like, Israel and the US likes, just like what they did in Iraq and Syria, okay, in Tehran. Let's say that happens. So that like scenario is they bomb the Iranians into submission, and they essentially win. I use that term loosely in a very short period of time, like what Trump is saying, which is um, 8, 10 days, like maybe 2 weeks, up to 2 weeks, and they win and they achieve their strategic objectives. So, so in that scenario, what happens? In that scenario, I think oil is going to fall really hard. Okay, just like Desert Storm 1 and Desert Storm 2, okay, the two Gulf Wars in the past, when it was apparent that the US military have had overwhelming advantages. Like, I don't know if you remember back then, right? They have like the night vision videos of the smart bombs going, the bunker busters, right? Like bombing Saddam Hussein back then, and they were just winning like every day, like kind of like what Trump said, at the congressional address, right? Whatever you call it, right? He said, "I'm tired of winning," like that, right? Back then. So let's say they're winning, and like I said, they achieve all their objectives. Oil would fall hard, just like DS1 and DS2. I think gold, silver consolidate, but it'll still go up in the long run, in the medium long run, because for gold, is simply a measure of well, for sure, the excess money that they're printing, right? So I think it will just take longer, it'll go up. For silver, I think for the US to reshore a lot of their manufacturing, which is in the long-term plan, right? They need the price of silver to be above $100 to make it worthwhile for the stuff to move back to the US, like smelting, etc. So that's scenario number one. And then I think scenario
One,
number
one,
two,
one
yes,
question, Eric, for scenario one.
yes.
What do you think happens to the Gulf cooperation countries? Because they're not very happy with what's happened to them. The American forces, they left, abandoned all the bases there that was supposed to defend them. Do you think if the US wins, like in this number one scenario, they'll go back to the US, or do you think they might even, they might be thinking of like joining BRICS? Do you think that's possible?
I think in scenario one, where the US actually wins and manage regime change in a very short time in Iran, I think the Gulf states are eventually going to have a deal with the US.
Okay.
So the
Okay.
BRICS is still going to exist, but the
Yeah.
Gulf states, they get whatever compensation for the failed defense, right,
Yeah.
of their buildings, infrastructure, whatever, and then things will just like the U.S. allies, right?
Yeah.
The partnership is going to get possibly stronger, right?
Yeah.
Because like somebody pointed out, the Arabs and the Muslims in general, right? There's a lot of at least on the surface, there's a lot of infighting because they're like there are different sects
Yeah.
within the Muslim religion, right?
That's right.
So
Yeah.
anyway, so like like that may happen. That's scenario number one. So, but I think that's not going to stop the BRICS because they're like China, India, Russia. That's like it's just deglobalization essentially,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like they still want like alternative in gold, um, in place of U.S. Treasury bonds. So, yeah, it's going to be slower in terms of the quotation marks de-dollarization, but in scenario one, it's still going to happen. So that's like again, I'm going to remind everybody. Scenario one, if Donald Trump achieves his you know um, military objectives in Iran, which is replacing the current regime with current government of Iran with a new American puppet regime. But that in itself can be a screw up, right? Look at what happened to
Yeah,
Afghanistan. Like
yeah.
they can just screw that up. So like, again, even in scenario number one, it can be hairy.
Let's look at scenario two then, Eric.
Okay. So scenario two is if the audience can just pretend that this scenario is possible. Okay. Scenario number two is if the US um, fighting Iran along with Israel, right, is actually facing a lot of difficulties, like what the alternative media is reporting. I know a lot of people question the authenticity of these reports, but let's just pretend that it's actually happening. Or it might be actually happening, right? Because I mean, I'm seeing a lot of credible sources reporting these things. Like, for example, the U.S. and Israel using up their munitions, like their anti-ballistic missile, um, their own missiles, right? They're just using it up when Iran is, firing these missiles at U.S. installations and Gulf partner, Gulf countries, infrastructure and U.S. bases all over the place, all over the Gulf, right? So let's say that is true. That is bogging down the U.S. and the Iranian and the Israelis, and Iranians have success in shutting down the Straits of Hormuz. Okay. So scenario number one, like, that all that is resolved, right? Because the US won. Scenario number two is saying that I wouldn't say the Iranians are winning, but it's a bogged down situation. Like what's happening in Ukraine with Russia, or like what happened to the US in Vietnam. Like the thing just get bogged down, and eventually the US might have to send ground troops to try to fight the Iranians. So in that scenario, I think, like I said, the Strait of Hormuz is shut down. I think oil is going to cross 100 US dollars per barrel.